And for this roundtable session, we are going to talk about promoting good governance in the Indo-Pacific region. Definitely not an easy task. And so we're going to leave it to our very capable moderator, President of the Prospect Foundation, Dr. Lai. So Dr. Lai, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks all of you for staying up until this moment. I know it's a very tiring conference, but apparently it still keeps you awake that you're interested in this topic. So thank you very much for your energy and enthusiasm. And second, I think we're come to the end of the last session, but always save the best for the last. Just look at the composition of the distinguished panelists. So we know that's definitely true. My name is Yichong Lai. I'm from Prospect Foundation. This panel is work on the promoting good governance in the Indo-Pacific region. As we can see from this morning until now, we have the touch upon the security aspects, the economics, and now the political. But I think in terms of the political, we must go beyond the so-called common value of the democracy, but we need to go to the issue about how the democracy can actually be worked at and be promoted and flourished in these regions. And that's what we call the good governance. As we could see from the Indo-Pacific regions here, there are several distinct features that stand out that needs to be addressed. The first thing is that we saw the decline of the democracy, at least not the advancement of democracy. There are already several reports about the political regression in the Southeast Asia, in South Asia, where the country previously has been committed to democracy, but now they are moving in a sort of backpedaling about the political development, and which is worrying. And second is that another trend we saw is that the Chinese promotion of the alternative governance model, and also in a different continent, we saw the Hungary, the president openly advocate for the so-called illiberal democracy. And so it is not just about the Hungary and China, but basically it is the kind of the rival or promotion of the rival government models that has been promoted. And something that as a democracy, we need to face this challenge. And of course, yes, something to do with some of the internal challenge that within a democracy need to be addressed. Otherwise, when we face the onslaught of the so-called promotion of the alternative governance model, that we are ill prepared to face this challenge. Now, the third trend, what we saw is that along with the big project of this One Belt One Road, which in China has been a vehicle for Chinese governance models exploitations. But along with the One Belt One Road, the practices also become the big challenge to the country. I call it as a weak democracy. That is a democratic informed or the country that is moving toward democracy, but the state capacity is still underdeveloped. And those challenges basically highlights right now puts the market and the democracy, the so-called political value, they are in a contrast. So this is a very interesting development that we need to look at. Because in the past, we have the traditional belief that the free market principle as well as the free democracy, they can go hand in hand. But now what we saw is that some countries actually putting those two as the dichotomy, opposite to each other, and force people to choose. Another challenge we saw in this trend is that some of them has been addressed earlier this morning. That is the fake news, especially the fake news coming from the authoritarian state, very pointedly targeted at taking advantage of the open and the free society of the democracy, and in order to challenge the domestic political development within those democracies in order for the better result of to fit those authoritarian regimes' political ends. So that those are the very important challenges, I think, when we talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific. Other than the very much established and thought of in the security realm, as well as slowly coming up, but also very easily recognizable, the economic realm. But how about the political, especially the societal realm, how we can deal with it? And finally, I think it is also important to notice that how we can envision Taiwan's role in meeting those challenges for the Indo-Pacific in terms of the good governance here. So those are the things that I'd like to highlight, and I wish our panelists could help us to enlighten us to meet this challenge. And today, we have a group of great panelists here. I will just introduce here according to the order. The first one will be Dr. Steve Feinstein. He is associate professor of the Boise State University, United States, but previously has been a deputy assistant secretary of state in the State Department for the Human Rights, and so he was the serving official in the past. And then the second panelist is Dr. Ro Sahashi. He's a director, Center for Asian Studies, Kanagawa University, Japan. And the third panelist is also the panelist that appeared in the morning, Dr. Jiang Li. He is the non-resident senior fellow of the United States Study Center, University of Sydney, Australia, and also as the Hudson Institute. And now the fourth panelist is from India, our distinguished Mr. Jayenda Ranade. He's a president, Center for China Analysis and Strategy, India. And finally, but not the last, is our very own Taiwanese, my good friend, old friend, Dr. Alan Yang. He is the executive director of the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. That is, the foundation has been tabled by President Tsai as the one that's a major vehicle for pushing forward the Taiwan southbound policy here. So without further ado, I will ask the Dr. Steve Feinstein first. You have 8 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the Prospect Foundation, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and the Center for New American Security for having me here today. I've really learned a lot, and I think it's been a very interesting set of sessions. I also want to mention that at Boise State University, I'm the Frank and Bethune Church Chair of Public Affairs. Senator Frank Church was actually one of the original co-sponsors of the Taiwan Relations Act. So I was instructed to make sure that I mentioned that today in Taipei and Taiwan, just so people are aware. I want to talk today about democracy trends, and I specifically want to talk about the intersection of technology and talk about how that issue, together with China's geopolitical interests, is really leading to some profound implications for the region. I think the key point with Dr. Lai mentioned in his opening is that democracy is under threat worldwide. It is under threat worldwide. It's also under threat in the Indo-Pacific region. If you look at some of the statistics very briefly in terms of what we know about democracy, currently 2.5 billion, about a third of the global population in the world, are now living through a process of what they call autocratization. In other words, that's the reverse process of democratization. People are living in political situations that are getting more and more repressive and autocratic. And a large part of that is due to the political situation in China. If you look at some of the statistics recently in indexes ranging from the Economist Democracy Index to Freedom House to the Variety of Democracies Index, you see statistics that show that 50% of countries in the world are demonstrating political declines, that only 5% of the world currently lives in a full democracy. And frankly, I think an important point to emphasize is that one of the bigger disruptors today when it comes to democracies is unfortunately my own country. It has inspired copycat behavior on a range of issues from fake news to advancing dangerous populist messages, as well as providing rhetorical support often for autocratic regimes. And so, I think we are at a difficult moment where there has been confusing and at times conflicting messages coming from the United States when it comes to democratic principles. So I want to talk about the role of technology in particular on governance and democracy. And I think that for me, a large part of how I got to this topic came from our own experience in the 2016 election, where we saw up front how the principles of information distortion and electoral manipulation can happen very easily in an advanced democracy, and we've subsequently seen how that's played out in many other electoral systems as well. And so the big takeaway is that this is not an isolated trend. This is something that is happening around the world, and that we're seeing it happen in a variety of contexts. So we're seeing the effects of artificial intelligence in terms of algorithms and social media feeds. We're seeing state-based cyber hacking that's increasingly sophisticated. We're seeing very advanced surveillance techniques combined with facial recognition and DNA biometrics. We're seeing censorship and information distortion return in pretty profound ways as well. I want to particularly focus on artificial intelligence for several reasons. I think first, its potential is transformative, and that it's an integrator of many other technologies. Second, we're already seeing how comprehensive artificial intelligence can be when used towards repressive ends. You can see its effect in places like Xinjiang in China, where a variety of different methods, everything from mass imprisonments, which is a very kind of physical technique combined with advanced surveillance of WeChat, communications, facial recognition tied to video surveillance, is really showcasing what is potentially possible when advanced technology and requisite political will combined with resources come together. At the moment with artificial intelligence, and I think there's really three aspects to emphasize when it comes to AI, there are really three things that are needed. You need to have the right algorithms in place that are accurate. You need to have advanced processing in order to run those algorithms in a reasonable manner. And you need to have access to the right amount of data. And so when you bring those three things together, then that's when you really can build an optimal system. At the moment in the world, the United States and China are the two global leaders. Now, China has access to the data first and foremost. It has algorithms that are increasingly improving, but it really lacks the processors. And so it has to rely on either external, mostly importing the right chips. The US has better algorithms. It has the processors, but it tends to have worse data. And one of the things that China has distinctly to its advantage on the data front is that not only does it have a database of 1 billion, 1.2 billion people, but it has a very low amount of constraints when it comes to how that information can be accessed. So let me pivot for a second then and talk about how AI is applying to the broader political trends that we're seeing worldwide. So in terms of authoritarian trends, one of the interesting things I found through my research is that the manner in which autocrats are exiting power is changing pretty significantly. Through the end of the Cold War, about 48% of exits happened through internal challenges, coups. But in the post-Cold War period, that has changed. And so two new tactics have come to bear. One, popular challenges, popular revolts are leading to changes in authoritarian exits. And two, losses in elections are taking place as well. And so in other words, the strategy for authoritarians who want to maintain political survival is shifted. Instead of having to head off internal challenges, they now have to shift and head off external challenges. And so therefore, what AI provides to those types of authoritarian regimes is a low-cost, high-impact strategy to preserve authoritarian rule. And so in other words, the demand for this type of technology is growing at a rapid pace. The China angle in this is several. What China is able to do is that it is spreading advanced technology like AI directly to these types of regimes. It's both building its domestic technological capability, as well as it's using initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative to spread this out. And so what you're seeing then is you're seeing a result where democratic stresses in the region are spreading from the proliferation of this technology. You're seeing China deliberately supply this technology in order to advance its geopolitical ambitions. And what China gets out of this deal is two things. Number one, it gets the ability to spread technology and spread a type of government that is more supportive of its own sphere of influence. But number two, it also creates reliance on its technology. And so it creates a larger sphere of dependency as well. So very quickly, in terms of how to address the situation, I think, first of all, many policymakers have come too late to understanding that AI development is serious and that there are necessary steps that are needed to confront this when it comes to the strength of democracies. AI affects, in general, both contested authoritarian states as well as democracies. And so I think there's a need to both think about the way that advancing democracies can lead the development of domestic regulations and guidelines, as well as to complement this domestic action by looking at international action as well in fora in which to address these issues. There's a big role for civil society to play, and I can talk about that in the question and answer section as well. I think my time is up. So why don't I stop right here? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Steve Feinstein. I think your take on the technology, especially on the AI side, about how its influence on our own existing democracy as well, how it empower the authoritarian regime's challenge to the democracy, that's very well taken. And second, I would like to ask Dr. Roy Sahashi for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for organizer for having me again to your events in Taipei. This is my great pleasure to come here. And I'm very glad to speak for this roundtable, titled Promoting Good Governance in Indo-Pacific Region. As you may know, Japan is the country which provide a really big amount of ODA, Official Developmental Aid, while Japan is relatively reluctant to emphasize on democracy promotion in the last few decades. Don't take me wrong, but the Japanese government has emphasized a lot on human security, but Japan is not the country who emphasize on democracy promotion and good governance like Taiwan and also United States. But what I want to share today with you is Japan has started to change itself and its aid policy and its foreign policy toward more democracy promotion and toward more good governance. And as so many previous speakers already mentioned about the kind of decline of democracy or challenges against democracy, including disinformation, fake news, fake media, sharp power, Confucius Institute, these authoritative challenges are well taken in Japan. And we regard, of course, Japan might be targeted by such authoritative challenges, but we really start to fear and start to perceive so many Asian countries, as well as African countries, are targeted by such democratic challenges. So, really good example to explain the change of Japan's behavior on democracy and good governance can be observed last 2 months in our response to Cambodian election. So as you know, last month we saw Cambodian election, general lower house election. And finally, Japanese government decided not to send monitoring group to Cambodia lower house election. And 30th of July, last month, 30th of July, Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga had a press remark. He has press remarks every day, but he said he decided not to send monitoring team to Cambodia. And he said he want to say no comment, want to keep no comments on domestic affairs of Cambodia. But he said the government will not send any monitoring group to the election in Cambodia. But 5 days later, Foreign Minister Kono, he actually said very clearly, his disappointment against Cambodian general elections. And he said Japan wanted to see the healthy democratization process in Cambodia. It is kind of great leap forward in terms of Japan's foreign policy. And actually, last few months, I think from around spring, so many Japanese specialists, including former United Nations, high-rank United Nations official, like Ambassador Akashi, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary to the United Nations and who was a representative Cambodian mission in 1990s, they start to say, we have to take care more seriously about Cambodian case and crisis of democracy in Asia. And we actually, including me, published a proposal to the government, and we submit that proposal to foreign minister and other 3 ministers. And we requested them to change our stance on democracy in Asia. And we encouraged them especially to look more carefully about Cambodian situations. And so many Diet members in lower house start to say the same thing. So I think from spring to this summer, what we are now seeing is Japanese policymakers start to realize the situation of democracy in Asia. Of course, this is not the first time we see such elements in Japan's foreign policy. Actually, in fact, Abe administration published its national security strategy 5 years ago, and they said we have to emphasize on healthy promotion of democracy in Asia. And 2 years later, they published a developmental cooperation charter. And under that scheme, they also de-emphasized that democracy promotion is very important to protect human rights. But so many people resist against the direct involvement to promotion of democracy in Asia and in Africa, because in Japan, still so many people regard the more important thing is poverty and global health and other human security related issues. But I think so many people start to realize the challenge is not that simple. And without healthy democratization process, we cannot protect the human rights and also human security. So having said that, so the challenge now is yes, thank you. Now Japanese government and administration start to realize the situation very quickly. So how can we collaborate with Taiwan, United States, and Australia, and India for that sake? And I think, of course, the very important thing is coordination of official developmental aids to each country in Asia and in the Pacific area. And also networking is very important. And I think unlike Taiwan and United States, we don't have any particular institution for democracy promotion like NED and TFD you have. But actually, we start to see some institution having big interest in promoting the democracy, and also so many specialists and experts who have worked in developmental consultant join that effort. So I think this is really good time from non-Japanese institutions to encourage Japan and Japan's policy-making community to invite more Japanese to the networking for the promotion of democracy. And I think the time is really ripe. And the really good thing is politicians, not only from non-ruling party, but also from ruling party, start to realize the situation very well, and they want to make more efforts. I recently met some very influential LDP, ruling party politicians, and he shows very big interest on the protection of democracy. So I think the time is really ripe, really right and ripe, and we have to take more coordinated steps to defend democracy and promote democratization in Asia. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sahashi. I think it's very good news to hear that Japan right now is more engaging in the overseas democratic promotions. And I believe that there's a fundamental thinking that Japan might want to change to this way. Especially Japan still had, at least in its own elite thinking, the World War II legacy issues they have to deal with. It. Right now, they seem started to walk out of the shadow. So I believe that's a confidence, and I congratulate Japan for doing this. And on the next, I would like to invite Dr. Jiang Li again from Australia to give us his comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to me that when President Xi announced that he had abolished presidential term limits, there wasn't much of a reaction from the region. I mean, there wasn't a lot of expression of disappointment. In fact, there wasn't even a lot of surprise. I think it was basically accepted. And more than that, if you read a lot of the commentary around the region, a very strong opinion around the region was that this may actually be good for China. This may actually help China undertake reforms and all those other things that China needs to do. When we think about good governance, and from the countries we come from, as is obvious, we think about democracy. But as Stephen mentioned, that is not a view that is necessarily widely shared, and I think in some ways it's a declining view. So I just want to spend maybe 5 minutes talking about why authoritarianism in our region is not just resilient, but actually becoming more attractive. I think, first of all, I think we have to face up to reality that outside the countries we come from, there actually aren't a lot of committed Democrats in a region. So I'll just cite one Pew survey, which was done last year from people in the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So 2 out of 3 are democracies. So of those countries, only 15%, 12%, and 8% respectively said that democracy was their preferred political system under all circumstances. Now, I think this is important because if you're a committed Democrat and things aren't going so well, you tend to blame the party in power. But if you're not a committed Democrat and things aren't going so well, you tend to blame democracy. So for those blaming democracy, I think that it's not a case that we have too much democracy in a particular country or in a region, but it's a case that the countries that are experiencing problems of democratic backsliding have weak liberal institutions. Now, I think we have to diagnose the problem quite accurately, because if we just pile everything on democracy, and if we just put forward democracy as the solution to all the problems, we leave ourselves open to the alternative argument, which is being run, that what you need is not democracy, but strong individuals that actually get things done. Like, this is an argument which I think has a lot of currency in the region. This leads to my second point, and I think that autocrats in our region, some autocrats in our region, have become much better at marketing and selling autocracy than have liberals in selling liberal institutions and democracy. So you look at our region and consider it as a political marketplace. The majority of countries in Indo-Pacific are developing economies that are yet to fully industrialize. So Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore are the exceptions. If you look at these other countries, they're basically straining to become middle-income countries, or they're trying to escape out of the so-called middle-income trap. Well, only a small number of countries like Malaysia and Thailand could possibly become high-income economies in the foreseeable future. Now, the message that autocratic governments and autocrats tell the region is that the lack of political freedom is actually an advantage. So last year, the fastest growing economies in East Asia were Laos, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and China. So all either authoritarian countries, or in the case of Philippines, a country suffering democratic backsliding. And I think it's true that modern authoritarianism approaches economically have demonstrated some capacity to generate rapid economic growth from a low base, and that is a vital condition, from a low base. They can force the mobilization of land, of capital, of even labour in some circumstances. Ruling elites tend to control the distribution of these resources, and political connections are the gateway to commercial opportunity. Now, economists tell us, and I think I agree, that this is not sustainable in the long run, but what it does is it prevents the emergence of an independent middle class from coming up in that country, and it's obviously very attractive to autocrats because it allows them to dispense privilege and economic opportunity and remain in power. This brings me to China, which has the greatest claims to authoritarian success. Now, China openly argues that authoritarian competence is outstripping liberal democratic dysfunction. And by way of contrast, China actively promotes its authoritarian model as one that is politically stable, that is technically superior, and better able to pursue sensible policies in a consistent manner. This is a change from a few years ago. A few years ago, I think China was very much on the defensive. They were just saying that our system is what's right for us, leave us alone. I think what we're seeing in the last few years is China actually actively promoting authoritarian models over democratic models. So I think we do need to combat that narrative. And there's a lot we can do to combat the narrative. Now, from a broad general point of view, we can point out that the only developed advanced economies in the world, with the exception of a few oil-rich Middle Eastern countries, are essentially democracies. But I don't think we should compete on crude economic performances because authoritarian countries from a low base can actually grow quite quickly. I think we do need to directly attack the Chinese narrative. So, for example, China claims that its model creates a better sense of order and structure in society. Well, we should, for example, point out that China spends more on domestic security through the People's Armed Police than they do in the PLA, using last year's figures around 20% more. The PAP is never idle in China. The numbers of mass unrest in China are in the hundreds of thousands, certainly well over 100,000. We can point out the amount China spends on surveillance, on keeping things under control. We can point out the opportunity cost for the CCP. The GDP of China, yes, it's growing quite quickly, but look at what the government spends money on. A quarter of its spending is on social goods, health, schools, etc. This compares to 36% average for middle-income countries, and is well beneath the 42% of OECD countries. The point I'm trying to make is that I'm not just gratuitously trying to point out things that aren't going well in China. What I'm really trying to say is that this narrative that the Chinese model offers social and economic and civil order ought to be contested. Even on the issue of economic competence, or, China puts forward the narrative that it sailed through the global financial crisis a decade ago. It didn't. As the economists all know, China engaged in a massive capital expenditure program, unprecedented in economic history, which it's now dealing with in terms of excess capacity and debt, etc. I think we have harmed our own cause by focusing too much on universal suffrage, that is one person, one vote, rather than on institutions that place greater checks, balances and accountability on the exercise of executive power, and also on the limitations of the government in the economy. Now, the purpose, I think, is to promote habits of accountability and transparency and compromise, encourage greater citizen participation, and the emergence of a genuinely middle class. Even if you have one person, one vote, you don't tend to get good outcomes without these institutions. So just to end, my point is that, yes, democracy promotion is important, but I think we need to talk about institutions rather than universal suffrage, because democracy will be judged on performance, not just on principles.
Yeah, thank you, Zhang Li. I think the last sentence you said is really right on, because you pointed out their weakness in terms of our Indo-Pacific region and democratic practices. And so that breeds all the resentment and help the alternative model get their popularity within this region. And so that also brings the issues about why the governance is so important and how we should address this. Now, the next, I would like to invite Dr. Jayadeva Ranade. I hope that I pronounced it right. Because every time I saw you already pronounce it wrong, so forgive me for this. And thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to, in fact, I've been grappling with how to view this, how to look at it, good governance in the Indo-Pacific region. And I do think of a few, shall I say, contradictions in the topic. Good governance means abiding by obligations. It means abiding by treaties. It means abiding by international agreements and following an internationally accepted norm and code of behavior. I think today in the Indo-Pacific, which from India's point of view, we view as a very expansive region from the shores of Africa to the shores of the United States, we have different kinds of governments in existence there. And particularly if we look at the South China Sea and this region, there are an equally large number of countries with different systems, and therefore applying one concept of good governance as we may look at it may be counterproductive. I think the bigger challenge, and John referred to it somewhat, is the challenge that emanates from China. It's put across its own concept of an alternate model of governance, something which it says is better than democracy as we all know it, and the concept of governance as we all know it. And at the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping enunciated that fairly clearly. And I think that is the challenge that we face today. Because along with that, what we are seeing is China unilaterally altering the status quo in a number of cases, not only in the South China Sea. We had a recent example last year where a tripartite international agreement that was signed between India, Bhutan, and China was violated by them. And we had a 73-day, fairly tense standoff with the Chinese. It was resolved, luckily, but it just is indicative of how the Chinese are operating, and if they can get away with it, they do. The same thing I notice is happening in the South China Sea, where they have unilaterally decided to lay claim to more than 80% of the South China Sea. They have repeatedly stated that they will, as they put it, recover sovereignty over that area, regardless of counterclaims. And they have proceeded with militarizing islands, building up their capacity in the place, including recovery of the South China Sea in the recruitment anthem of the PLA Navy. And their ambassador in Washington, Cui Tiankai, in 2013, in fact, Cui Tiankai, he said that China has been in this region for much longer than the United States, and therefore, while the United States is welcome, it must remember that it is Chinese territory. So they have made their position very clear. At the same time, when the Philippines challenged them and the matter was taken to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, once the decision came through, in fact, it went much further than many of us thought. It dismissed China's claims, historically, the historic claims and otherwise, but China ignored it. It rubbished the decision of the PCA and continued as before. In fact, since then, their warship building activity has increased. So now we find them building, adding one destroyer every 3 months to the PLA Navy. They're building landing craft. Just since January, in fact, they've added 19 warships to the PLA Navy. So their intent, I think, is very clear, the way they're going about it. And at the 19th Party Congress last year, Xi Jinping also benchmarked where China will be over the next few years. And 2021, which was the 100th year of the Chinese Communist Party, was the year where he said the China dream will be realized, and that does include rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation, which means recovery of some of the territories. 2030 was the year by which there'll be a technologically advanced power, and 2049-50 is when they will rival, if not surpass, the United States of America. It'll be a country with pioneering global influence. I think these are this is a sign of the self-confidence, maybe even the overconfidence of Xi Jinping, but it's a sign that he is intent on achieving these milestones. And that is, I think, the warning for countries which want to ensure that the international norms are abided by, that democracy continues, democracy the way we know it continues, and the alternate model that is suggested by Xi Jinping does not really come into being. So I think when we talk of good governance, we need to look at the different forms of governments that exist and perhaps recalibrate our definition in order to strengthen them so that a grouping can be formed which is much stronger and wider in perspective. And here I'll just conclude by saying that in my own view, I think we should look at countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, Japan, India, of course, United States, if it joins, and draw them in, Australia, into a grouping that maintains international norms and a semblance of international norms in the Indo-Pacific region. And since we are in Taipei, let me just mention a couple of points which can help ease the pressure on Taiwan, the squeezing of space that we are seeing happen, quite ruthlessly, if I may add. And here, one of the two or couple of things that can come in and which we'll see whether there is a broad commitment or not, would be for Taiwan to try and project itself as maybe a center from where humanitarian assistance and relief can be provided to the countries of the region in case disaster strikes. This could be a center. It'll automatically mean recognizing, even if implicitly, Taiwan's role. And the second could be like an anti-piracy center, where again, this could be the base from which, out of which countries can operate and try and function to control piracy. In a manner of speaking, what this will do is it will represent a pushback to China's unilateral changing of the rules of the game in this region. So I'll stop here and comment later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ranade, for your comments. And of course, you talk about the grouping of the like-minded democracy altogether in the Indo-Pacific regions in order to safeguard the norm and the practices. Of course, people will start to ask that how this group will be able to ensure the norm that be practiced also followed by other countries. But I think I'll take it to the heart about your suggestion for Taiwan, how that time could be a center for something. So that's very heartening and encouraging. With that note, I would like to ask our Taiwanese friend, my good friend, Dr. Alan Yang, how are you going to proceed with this? Okay.
Thank you, Chair, President Lai. And first of all, I would like to thank for the invitation sent by the Prospect Foundation to invite me to attend this roundtable. And I think this is a very meaningful timing for us to reconsider the term of good governance in terms of with a more democratic and liberal essence, countering the rise of the public awareness of the authoritarian alternative. So I think, well, my take here is to do some kind of sharing the information of how Taiwan can be contextualized in the free and open regional order in the Indo-Pacific, and also to highlight the discussion of good governance among Taiwanese society and what Taiwan can really contribute and pursue. I will say that the definition of good governance, without any doubt, is shared a common understanding among the governments and also civil society in the Indo-Pacific region. And most of the discussion focus on the democratic value and also the liberal process, liberal and also transparent process of decision making. And however, we will see that there is some kind of a rising alternative, authoritarian alternative to mostly focus on the feature of efficiency and also the effectiveness. And then to shape a common understanding of, only focus on the effectiveness and efficiency that will create, the result of the good governance. So I would say that my understanding of the good governance will focus on 5 specific features. Well, the first one will be the transparent. The second one will be the inclusiveness. The third one will be the sustainability. And finally, I think it's related to the topic of the free and open order, that is the rule-based and rule of law. Regarding the transparency of the transparency attribute of the good governance, I think it's related to a transparent information sharing process and also decision-making process and also the resource sharing process. When it comes to the inclusiveness, definitely it is related to the stakeholder and also the partnership that foster a community within the region. And also the third one, which is, I would say, the main agenda of to promote or to operate the idea of good governance, that is related to the sustainability in the world, especially the sustainable development goal promoted by UN and also the global civil societies, the main point of the good governance practice in the region. And of course, the fourth one is the institutional arrangement, according to our previous panelists, that is related to the international norm, international rule. The rule of law play a very important role in the definition of the good governance. And according to Taiwan, Taiwan has tried its best since during the past decade to contribute to the international good governance and also the practice of good governance in the region and beyond. Since 2016, the government, Taiwanese government, has promoted the idea of the New Southbound Policy as the flagship program of, promoting Taiwan and also contextualizing Taiwan in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and even a broader sense of Asian community. And the way Taiwan has prioritized its contribution and engagement are through different engagement, different approach. For example, currently we try to promote the 5 flagship program focus on different need from the region on some specific issue. For example, the personnel training for the next generation, industrial talent training, and also the innovation industry, and also related to national and regional economic growth. The third one focused on medical service and also the medical facility connectivity related to the growth of the industry. And the fourth one, I think is specifically important, is the contribution to the regional agriculture. For example, this year, Taiwan has come to the agreement with our Indonesian counterpart to set up an integrated agricultural demonstration zone in the area of Kalawang, in just nearby Jakarta in Indonesia. For this kind of contribution and this kind of resource sharing process, Taiwan would like to focus on more highlights on the transparency, inclusiveness, sustainability, and also the rule of law. So if we look at Taiwan's contribution and also to include Taiwan in the context of free and open order, free and open Indo-Pacific framework, we can find that there have been some initiative related to the practice of good governance. As I mentioned, the 4, even to 5 flagship program, this is not only to share the civil society and Taiwanese society's best practice in achieving the sustainability goal, but also to jointly explore the regional best practice working with our friend. So I think the successful practice of free and open Indo-Pacific definitely rely on the solid social connectivity and also the vibrant civil society engagement. And this is not only the initiative provided and promoted by the regional governance, but also the connectivity among different society, civilian sector, and even the community at the ground. So I would say, I would like to share some of the update of the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation as a way or as a story, how Taiwan will proceed and how Taiwan will further engage working with our regional counterpart to promote the idea of good governance. The foundation has two different roles. The first one is to facilitate. We facilitate different engagement working with our stakeholder in the region. For example, working with the talent, the young leader of different policy community, working with the policy think tank for the dialogue and even the joint project of the brainstorming some regional policy. And also we focus more on the civil society connectivity. In this August, we initiated an Asian Engagement Consortium, which include different civil society group and also the NGO in Taiwan, involving in trade and also business sector and also the NGO sectors. Let me share with you one of our member institution, Taiwan Aid. This is a Taiwan Alliance in the international development. They have more than 29 NGO working on development issue in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Through the alliance of this kind of NGO, they are promoting the good governance on the ground by promoting and providing the capacity building program and also to some extent to provide an empowerment project in the region. So I will argue that the connectivity among the society will provide a solid base for the good governance and also the best practice of the regional good governance in the Indo-Pacific area. And I think I would like to wrap up. Taiwan for sure is a part of the Indo-Pacific regional community and also a very important indispensable link of the regional network, including ASEAN-led, including different competing approach of the Asian policy. But in order to ensure the free and open order in the Indo-Pacific area, as I mentioned, the practice and also the fully engagement of the New Southbound policies will be continuously contributing to the good governance of the region and also the national growth. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alan Yang, for your introduction of the New Southbound policy, and particularly in the issues about how Taiwan's NGO works, help to promote or enhance the good governance practices and the spread among our Southeast Asia, South Asia friends. That will, in a way that to help to promote and improve the spread of the good governance in the Pacific regions. So that now let's just open up to the floor. If you have any questions, please identify yourself and address to who exactly you want to ask questions, or you can just open up. All right, and anyone want to? Yes, Dan.
Dan Kleiman, it's nice to be on the other side of this now. So I actually wanted to throw back a question that came up in our earlier security session, but is particularly relevant for this one, which is China's domestic political interference. That if we're thinking about promoting good governance, sustaining democracy, how to address Chinese interference in democracies is a key question. And I'd be particularly interested, John, to hear your thoughts, but also others if they want, on sort of what steps democracies can take to become harder targets on that.
The experience Australia's gone through is actually, I shouldn't say renewed, because I've always had faith, has reinforced my faith in liberal democracies with strong institutions and strong civil societies, because when I was in government, you know, an implicit decision was taken to become very public about this issue. The Australian government, for those of you who don't know, wanted to pass some legislation that would prohibit forms of foreign interference, that would demand more transparency in donations, you know, the sorts of things you would expect that Australian laws, Australia did not have laws that when we should have on these sorts of things. And we knew it would create a huge backlash from China. But we decided to go public because, you know, it's the sunshine's the best disinfectant type philosophy, that there are obvious forms of interference and covert influence, and there are more subtle forms, and the more you make that a public issue, the more people are aware of it. So at the very least, one, Australian publics can't say, I didn't realise accepting this money would lead to this chain of events. Secondly, you know, to put it very, very bluntly, it sort of became socially acceptable to kind of accept money and do stuff. And we wanted to make it not so socially acceptable. So the more publicly we came out with this problem and this challenge, we thought the better it would be. And, you know, obviously the legislation is an important part of it, but supporting that was that the Australian public offered overwhelming support for, you know, what the government was trying to do, and by virtue of that, the opposition offered very strong support for the legislation. There were some complaints from some business groups, etc. But by and large, I think it's not just about the legislation to help improve the robustness of your institutions. We took a gamble on the sort of strength of our civil society, and they responded. So I'm not saying instantly we solved the issue of covert interference or influence, but it's now a lot harder for the Chinese to do what they have been doing in Australia. And I think that, you know, that's quite an important message, certainly.
Yeah, let me just add a point. You know, I think one of the interesting things to consider when it comes to the technological side and how to blunt the impact of technological interference from China is to think about, particularly in Taiwan's situation, you know, what are two aspects or two advantages that Taiwan potentially provides to China. One of them is semiconductor chips, and the second is a technological know-how and expertise of its people, both of which go directly to China and help to lead to the increasing sophistication and advancements of its industries, which are then used towards repressive ends. So one thing to think about would be, if those are two aspects that are being supplied to China, is there legislation or other types of policies that would dissuade or incentivize those two aspects going to other places? I would also say that if you think about what gets exported, and this is something that the United States has grappled with quite a bit, there are a number of Chinese products that have vulnerabilities and are compromised, such as Huawei handsets, which have backdoors that are built into them. So as I understand it, Huawei is free to sell whatever it would like in Taiwan, and many other products similarly that have compromises also are sold in Taiwan. It may be worth thinking about as well, are there certain types of vulnerabilities that come from China that maybe Taiwan should start to put regulations in, or at least to sort of demand that some of those types of vulnerabilities and backdoors are not included in those products. So just food for thought when it comes to Taiwan's specific role in that aspect.
Okay, talk about Huawei, the sad story that we have to endure. It's sort of legacy issues that we have to deal with. Okay, I'll just stop here. Any other questions? Yes?
I think we've spoken a lot about the distinction between autocracies and democracies. It strikes me that we should also think about how do we address the issue of popularly elected leaders like Duterte or like Aung San Suu Kyi who at the same time seem to be undermining human rights in their country, do not have the respect for the rule of law, that is an issue that in some way is the product of a democratic system, but a malfunctioning democratic system. So how do you address the fact that a lot of good governance issues are not just coming, or a lot of poor governance issues are not just arising from autocratic countries, but also from democratic countries in the region?
All right, that's a very tough question. Whoever wants to take this, John Lee, yeah?
There we go. Yeah, I mean, the challenge, the Duterte in the Philippines is a particular challenge because, you know, I mean, Myanmar is it's a pseudo-democracy. I mean, it's not really in the sense that the civil government doesn't really have a lot of power. But the Philippines, I think, is a better case model for the question you're asking. And it's difficult because, you know, as you probably know, Duterte has enjoyed the highest approval ratings of any Filipino president, you know, I think for about 20 years, or since they had polling on these things, about 80% approval rating. And this goes back to my point about about the perception, and often it's actually accurate, that democratic countries with poor institutions or poor civil societies don't deliver. So that opens the doorway for Duterte to come in and say, I am what you need. Who cares about rules? I will get rid of these drug traffickers and I will get rid of corruption. And I think, you know, that's where I think there's no instant solution, but that's where countries just have to keep on plugging away at strengthening the civil societies and civil institutions in those countries. So, say from a government-to-government point of view, I mean, when you know I was in the Australian government, no, you couldn't really go to Duterte and just say stop it; he'll throw you out of the room. But the Australian government put renewed emphasis or even more resources on actually dealing with Filipino institutions and civil groups, etc. All the while, sort of, you know, having a pretty good relationship at its leader level with Duterte. And, you know, it's not really a instant solution, but I think in that kind of situation, it's the best we can do. But I think it goes back to my earlier point that we really want to focus on building up institutions in a country rather than focusing straight away on universal suffrage. So Vietnam's a good example. You know, we could push for you must have democracy now, but without those institutions, democracy will not deliver and will not survive, I think, in a country like Vietnam.
Yeah, just to add a point, you know, I think one of the big flaws of U.S. foreign policy in the past has been to sort of take an all-or-nothing approach when it comes to regimes that are committing atrocities or other abuses against their citizens, where the response has been either we maintain a full bilateral relationship or we implement a full slate of sanctions, but there's been very little in between. I think one of the things that has evolved in terms of at least U.S. foreign policy is the notion that you can maintain a broader relationship with the citizens of a country, both through civil society engagement, but also through other types of engagement, but that you try to isolate the bad actors in a particular regime, you know, the security forces that are committing abuses and so forth, through other types of techniques and approaches, whether it's targeted sanctions, whether it's not including them in certain types of specific types of initiatives. But I think it's important to have nuance. You know, given in the Philippines, it's not an easy situation. There's a long-standing history of engagement. They're an important partner to the United States, and yet the atrocities that are being committed under Duterte are real and significant. So trying to find a way to nuance a policy where you recognize the abuses that are being occurred and you call them out, but you also maintain broader engagement with the Philippines, I think is important.
Yeah, actually, that problem, I mean, illiberal democracy is well recognized recently, not only Hungary, Philippines, and Myanmar. And in Philippine case, we recognize dozens of fake media already established in the sphere of social network service. So, but I don't think, the government approach can really make successful for kind of democratization from outside on Filipino. So I just want to say the same thing for the other two speakers. Civil society to civil society approach is most important. And I don't know how can we do it together, but we try to have more connection with not Duterte, pro-Duterte, or I can say non-governmental people. Now they have some hardship in the Philippines, but maybe we can protect them, or we can work with them for the future democratization process again.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to add my 2 points. I think first of all, we need to recognize that Myanmar is not yet a democracy. Myanmar is a country that's moving toward in the process of political transitions. And the leaders, or even the Aung San Suu Kyi, although she effectively be the leader of the country, but nominally she's not, due to some of the constitution. And that speaks something, that even her, there's a certain constraints about the capability or capacity that the person that can have. But the issue is not about Aung San Suu Kyi herself. It is about the wider issues about how a country with a very weak institution or no institution at all, moving toward democracy, how to deal with some of the legacy issues. And especially some of the legacy issues, they have certain support within the society, how to address them. And so that's why the so-called nuanced approach, I think, probably that's right now the most sensible one that we need to deal with. Because that also makes me remind about some example in Taiwan, although it's a complete different cases, where in the early 90s, when Taiwan was moving from the dictatorship toward liberalization toward democracy, there are several issues related with the environmental protections, which Taiwan has been harshly criticized for rain horns and others, and killing and all those. And at that time, they erased a certain nationalistic response from Taiwan, and also coupled with some of the issue about Taiwan international isolation. So there's a group of voices that, how could you blame us? Because we are isolated, and we have no representation. So no representation, no tax, no representation, no punishment. Yeah, so that kind of the issue coming up. And it takes time for people to realize that despite no representation, but there's a value here. You just cannot do whatever thing you like, violating the values. It takes a certain period for people to realize that. Of course, this is not a very suitable example, but I'm just like to address that in the wider issues about the country moving toward democracy. The transition process is actually more important. How to harness this development is something that we need to think about. Thank you. And other questions? Really no questions? Okay, it seems that everybody is very satisfied with the discussions. And here I will just call the conclusion for this session. And thanks for all our panelists giving us very wonderful remarks and food for thought. And although this is the last session, but definitely not the least session. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lai, and thank all our panelists. So we will proceed to our next session. So I will ask the panelists for this particular session to move down to the stage. So as we have been mentioning throughout the whole day, that this project, this conference today is actually a collaboration between 3 distinguished think tanks. One is the Prospect Foundation from Taiwan, one is the Center for New American Security from the United States, and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation from Japan. So to successfully conclude today's program, we would like to invite the representatives from these 3 distinguished think tanks to give us a closing remarks and kind of having a reflections on how the overall ideas of how this conference has been. And I would first like to to invite the Executive Director of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Ms. Chano, to give us her closing remarks.
All right, thank you for your kind introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It really gives me great pleasure to make a few remarks in closing this highly important and esteemed dialogue concerning Indo-Pacific security. So I first would like to convey my gratitude to our distinguished speakers from the morning, speakers and experts from the morning, coming from Taiwan, in Australia, India, the United States, and Japan. I think your profound insights and also candid discussion that followed enormously helped us move forward with the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific region, because the concept itself is still evolving, and also somebody put it ongoing, and can be enriched through discussions like today, involving people representing different parts of the region and also from different backgrounds. So what we have witnessed together today is steady development of the sense of collective security, hand in hand with economic prosperity, while making sure the value and importance of democracy is not being compromised. And perhaps more importantly, the conference has successfully planted seeds in all of us so that we keep on thinking about how we can collaborate and perhaps take concrete measures and actions from now on. So in conclusion, I think the timeliness of, and also how the effectiveness of the conference is really great. So in that sense, I really would like to congratulate the Prospect Foundation under the leadership of Dr. Chen for the success of the conference. And also especially you took the courage of transforming the trilateral dialogue into a more inclusive dialogue of the five and stimulating dialogue of the five. The Sasakawa Peace Foundation has been enjoying the partnership with the Prospect Foundation, and I hope to continue this partnership. I also would like to thank the Center for New American Security, represented by Dr. Kleiman, for this opportunity to work together. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you here today who have actively participated into the discussion. So we sure did, through these discussions, we sure contribute to improving the security and prosperity of this Indo-Pacific region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Chano. I'd like to invite Dr. Kleiman from the Center of New American Security.
Thank you. This has been a very rich discussion, and we're especially grateful for everyone who stayed here the entire time. We've covered a huge breadth of topics. I want to, in the next probably 3 minutes, try to pull together a number of kind of common threads, knowing that we can't do justice to the full day of discussion. I think it was quite striking that China's rise, its increasing influence in the security as well as diplomatic and economic domains has been a kind of recurring thread throughout today, often a starting point for the discussion. And to be pretty blunt, I mean, I think we are in part, if not largely, here today because of growing concerns across democracies in the region and beyond, that the future of the Indo-Pacific may not be free, it may not be open. And to be perhaps even more blunt and more provocative, that we're here today because there is a not inconsequential probability that Beijing's vision of a world made up of spheres of influence, of rigged economic interactions, and rising authoritarianism could actually become a reality in the Indo-Pacific and potentially beyond. Yet China, in my view, should be the start and certainly not the end of the conversation, and thankfully it was that way today. That ultimately, whether or not the Indo-Pacific is free and open hinges on the choices that democracies in the region and beyond make, I would say much more so than China's choices. And while we certainly should not be complacent that our vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific will, by default, become the reality, we should also not, I think, make the mistake of de-emphasizing our own enduring strengths, looking at democracies in the region and beyond. whether it is military strengths, economic, or ideological for that matter. So what should the democracies that were represented here today, what should they do to achieve this vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific? There were many, I think, stimulating, interesting ideas put forward both by folks from the floor as well as panelists and discussants. So just to run through a few that I thought were particularly intriguing or notable. One was strengthening democratic resiliency, which happened, an idea that came up in the last panel, both looking at our own democracies at home, but also good governance in the wider region. Second, pursuing a vigorous multilateral high-quality trade and investment agenda in the region, recognizing that especially on the US side today, that is somewhat challenging domestically. Third, working together to coordinate our economic engagement across the region to ensure that countries have choices beyond China in terms of their investment in broader economic relationships. Fourth, and finally, to responsibly share security, for example, by enhancing coordination of capacity building in third countries, and critically, as democracies, making the military investments needed to ensure that collectively we have the ability to shape a favorable balance of power in the years ahead. Those are only a few of the many, I think, stimulating and interesting ideas that we came up with for how we actually turn this vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific into a reality. In closing, on behalf of the Center for New American Security, I would like to thank the other co-organizers of this conference, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and of course the Prospect Foundation. In particular, I want to recognize the Prospect Foundation for a really flawless execution of this conference. If we could just give a hand to the many staff members here who I think probably have toiled for a week or so to put this all on. Thank you for, certainly the logistics were flawless. And then to close, I want to say I think today's conference very much demonstrated, again, to thank the Prospect Foundation, demonstrated in a very tangible and practical way how Taiwan can play an active and very much value-added role in helping democracies across the region to advance this goal of a free and open Pacific. So thank you all for a very stimulating conference.
Thank you, Dr. Kleeman. And last but not least, President of the Prospect Foundation, Dr. Lai.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to, on behalf of the Prospect Foundation, thanks our partners, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, as well as the Center for New American Security, for helping us all together to host this great conference, in which not only we broaden our appeals from the traditional Taiwan, US, Japan to include more countries, but also the content as well as the premises about the subject on the discussions, and that was vastly different from the things that we have in the past. I think what Dan already said 99% of the things I wanted to say. So yes, I could be just a little bit lazy, say things just end up here, but I'm not. Because I like to point out, one of the features to me that stand out is that in the past, when a conference with Taiwan in, the issue about Taiwan is always that how to solve the Taiwan issue, how to get things going. But this conference is different in terms of Taiwan is already part of the solution as a premises. So that Taiwan contribution is recognized, that it is just how Taiwan can contribute. Where is Taiwan's strengths? Where are the Taiwan things that will be cherished and be shared by our country and friends in this region? So this is the thing from the Taiwanese perspective that we feel heartily encouraged, and that is the most surprising to us. So I just like to take this opportunity again. I wish the conference, I believe the conference will continue, and I believe that we all three should be able to work together further on to get a more in-depth discussion and get more ideas about how to get a free and open Indo-Pacific. Although we know Pacific is not free, right? It's not like free pizza. Yeah. All right. So in closing, Dan just said that he acknowledged our staff here for helping this flawless conference. So here I just like to ask our staff to stand up and be recognized by our guests here. Please. And just please, everyone, give them a hand. Nora, up. Probably they're just too shy, but thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Lai. And before I proudly announce the adjournment of this conference, I just want to make a final announcement as the MC here. For our foreign overseas guests who will be joining a MOFA dinner tonight, please be at the lobby at 6 sharp. 6 sharp. You will be taking a transportation to MOFA. So those who are attending a MOFA dinner tonight, our overseas guests, please be at the lobby at 6 sharp. And last but not least, I'll probably announce the adjournment of this year's conference on the 2018 Promoting a Free and Open Indo-Pacific region. And we welcome you all here, and we hope to see you next year. Thank you.